Okay, so we'll go ahead and start our next chapter. And this is going to be over person perception and how we form impressions of people we really don't know, and how it's really hard sometimes to change those initial impressions. So we'll go ahead and get started here. All right, so how and why do we make first impressions so quickly? So quickly. Okay. So, within seconds of meeting somebody, we basically begin making judgments. Okay, we try to determine, or we do determine, again, this goes back to automaticity. Are they friendly or unfriendly? This could be through verbal or nonverbal behavior. Do they seem competent, incompetent, trustworthy, untrustworthy, confident, secure? Is it somebody that you're getting a good vibe from? That might indicate a first impression, even. But here's the thing, we really don't have a lot of information. And, the first day of class, whether it's with a student, another student, classmate, instructor, you're already starting to notice, like, okay, who's going to be approachable? Which instructors are going to be approachable? Who seems confident? Who seems friendly? Who would you actually go up and talk to? And again, it's usually not intentional. This kind of starts on its own. And again, this goes back to that automaticity, that automatic processing, system one thinking that we were just talking about. The scheme is in accessibility. What makes them seem friendly or competent or trustworthy? And what we're doing here is we're observing behavior, and from that behavior, we're interpreting what type of person they are. Okay, so for example, maybe they don't make eye contact, they sit back, they're quiet. And so we see quiet behavior. And we might infer or assume maybe they're shy. We might assume they're unfriendly, maybe they're nervous, maybe they're just not interested at all. But did we actually see any of those traits? Did we see that they're shy, unfriendly, nervous, or uninterested? No. We just made those assumptions based upon the behaviors that we witnessed. So, again, how do we go from that very limited information that we start with to making impressions of who somebody is in their totality? So, okay, let's just do this ourselves. So, look at each of these just for a few seconds. For each one, again, just glance over them. Who seems most trustworthy or most confident? Who would you most likely want to work with? And which person seems to most likely be a leader? Again, don't overthink it, just go with your first impression. Now, I'm going to keep talking. If you would like to observe these people any longer, go ahead and do so. But what I would do if this were an in-person class, I would go ahead and pick a couple of these and ask for examples of for example, let's talk about the first gentleman here up in the top left corner. Okay, what was your first impression? Okay, maybe he seems kind, confident. Maybe he does seem trustworthy. Maybe he doesn't look like somebody you want to work with. Okay, and then I would ask, well, what did you base that on? Because literally, you're looking at a picture of somebody, you know nothing about them. And so you might have to say something like, okay, he has a little bit of a smile. His eyes are soft. Maybe it's his posture, the clothing he's wearing, his appearance, or vibe. Again, I keep going back to vibe. And just so we're clear here, a vibe. A vibe is, if we want to know the technical definition of a vibe, if you would like this for future use, a judgment without knowing all the steps that produced it. Again, I don't know how I got here, but I got here. And again, through usually automatic processing. And again, the question is, how much do you actually know about these people? And the answer is nothing. Yet we've already judged their personality, whether you can trust them, their competence, possibly their leadership. And here's the thing is first impressions aren't always wrong. They can usually or sometimes contain very useful information. In some situations, you can get very good information from those first impressions, but they can also be misleading. So let's go ahead and talk about, okay, person perception. basically the title of this entire lecture. But this is the process of forming impressions and making judgments about other people, how we perceive other people through basically, again, how we're interpreting, forming impressions, and judging people. Okay. And again, we use information like we just talked about, appearance, behavior, nonverbal communication or cues, context. So what's the situation and prior expectations or experiences or knowledge? All of those things come together to result in an impression. And again, through automatic processing or system one thinking, we often form this impression of other people before we even recognize that we're doing it. Again, the brain is going to fill the gap in that it's first day of class, maybe we're focused on other things, and there's all of these people around us, including the instructor. You probably are not going from person to person to person, forming first impressions. Your brain is going to automatically do that for you based upon these things. Yes, you might recognize that you have that first impression, but how did you get there? You're not going through those steps one after another after another. What we're doing, okay, this goes back to subjective construal. We're interpreting reality through automaticity in order to form impressions of people. Again, we don't see people as they are, we interpret people as we are. But okay, here's the thing is that there's only parts of people that we can actually witness or observe, and that is going to be their direct or physical behaviors and cues. From that, we infer or assume their traits. Again, those are not the same thing. That's going to be important for this entire week. So, how much can we actually learn from only a few seconds of someone's behavior? This gets back into thin slices, which we keep going back to. Impressions from very brief observations of behavior. Again, a tiny, tiny bit of information very quickly provides information to the brain, basically a tiny information to the brain that the brain uses to create an entire impression of somebody. Again, judgments made from almost nothing, brief samples of information that our brain uses to complete conclusions. And again, sometimes they can be accurate. First impressions are not always right, though. Again, some characteristics are much easier to detect than others. But again, accuracy depends on what we're actually trying to judge as well. Are we trying to judge, okay, even, oh, man, you can kind of judge how friendly somebody is. It's going to be harder to judge, again, off of these first impressions. Okay, are they a psychopath? That's actually very, very difficult. I know that those are very extreme examples, but that's the best I could come up with right now. Now, okay, good. Those hidden traits, like psychopathy, or intentions are much harder to detect. Now, again, speed does not equal accuracy, as we talked about, and confidence does not equal accuracy either. You need evidence before trusting an impression, but again, we don't commonly step back and obtain that evidence. All right, so let's look at one of the studies associated with this. Amity and Rosenthal in 1993. Okay, this was a classic thin slice research. Now, students watched a brief silent video of clips of college instructors. Now, they did not know these instructors. That's important. The clips were silent. There was no lecture content, only brief nonverbal behavior. So all they could see was the nonverbal silent behavior. Some were extremely short. So some were 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 6 seconds. Okay, and then their ratings were compared with evaluations from students who had taken an entire course with the instructor. Okay, so literally they rated the instructors. Sorry, that's not included here. It should just say they rated the instructors. And what they were trying to see was, were those ratings of the instructors similar to those that students provided at the end of the semester? just based upon 6 seconds, 15 seconds, and 30 seconds. So they were looking at like, could 6 seconds of information, nonverbal, silent information from this instructor provide any meaningful information? Okay. So here's what they found. Let's go to the next one. All right. So even very short clips, they actually found meaningful agreement with broader evaluations from the end of the semester. So, and the students were surprised, of course, but here's the thing. Again, what this indicates is that they do find a significant relationship between the ratings or the impressions that those students had from 6 seconds compared to those at the end of the semester after students had spent an entire semester with that instructor. And so that indicates that thin slices can provide us very important information in some cases. Now, it cannot be generalized across the board, just so we're clear here. In this one instance, it did work. Um, in this one specific context, it can work. So this might, brief behavior, it can reveal cues about expressiveness, enthusiasm, confidence, warmth, and engagement. Oops, that is my part. So again, it can provide useful information about certain things, but not everything about the entire person. Also, here's a part of this that I guess is kind of interesting, in that we're very sensitive to social or nonverbal cues. And the repeated behavioral patterns can show up quickly. When you sit in a classroom, watch your instructors. We do have very specific nonverbal tics. Okay, some of us are going to use our hands in specific ways. Some of us are going to pace. Some of us probably are going to carry things. Some of us probably contort our faces in certain ways. There's a lot of nonverbal behaviors that we exude that you interpret in specific ways and apply that to who we actually are. Um, but again, that doesn't mean that you know who we are in totality, but it might provide information as to some of these things. For example, with an instructor that uses a lot of hand movements, waves arms everywhere when they're lecturing, they might have a lot of enthusiasm for the class and the topic at hand. That might be the case. You might be spot on with that. So again, first impressions universally are not always accurate, but some judgments can contain real information. So it might be harder to infer things like honesty. Again, right off the bat, when we're doing this, honesty, values, intelligence, motives, what somebody's going to do in every situation. Again, so the question is, what could you probably judge fairly well in 30 seconds? Like these students did. What's something that you think you could absolutely not trust yourself to judge at all? Maybe you could, again, maybe how energetic or expressive somebody is. Maybe when it comes to somebody's moral character, maybe not. Trustworthiness? That's a tough one. You might need more information. Okay, again, this goes back to automatic processing because this is the process that's used to develop these first impressions. It's not necessarily bad. It's part of efficiency and evolved mechanisms. And it can help us extract useful patterns quickly that we use in order kind of to get to know somebody. Okay, so basically, again, we're constantly reading nonverbal cues. We're forming impressions from cues like facial expressions, eye contact, posture, gestures, tone of voice, personal space, everything that we just talked about in the last slide. Again, you can tell somebody's uncomfortable without them saying it. Even before you consciously recognize it, you could tell if somebody's uncomfortable. You could tell if they're comfortable. But when somebody's uncomfortable, okay, maybe they're crossing their arms, they're looking away, fidgeting, they're quiet, just their facial expression, the tone of their voice, how distant they're standing from others. Now, here's the thing though, okay? That's how we interpret it. Now, here's the thing, because does crossed arms actually mean uncomfortable though? It doesn't. It doesn't. That's what we assume based upon if you are uh, from okay, a certain culture, that's what you would assume. That's how you would interpret it. It doesn't mean that objectively. It could mean maybe they're cold. Maybe they're just comfortable. Maybe it's a habit. Maybe there's nowhere for their arms to go. But that might be how we're going to interpret it, is that they're uncomfortable. So the cue does not necessarily mean there's an objective meaning, but we interpret it based upon what we have experienced in the past, what we have been taught it communicates. Depending upon who you are, what situation it is, what culture you're from. Same thing with eye contact. It gives us information, not direct access to somebody's mind necessarily. Okay, so let's say somebody's looking at their phone while you're talking. What could that mean? Okay, to me, rude. But that's probably because of the culture I come from, definitely my generation. For others, maybe you think like they're bored with your conversation. Maybe you do think they're rude. Maybe they're waiting for an important message. Maybe they're anxious. Maybe they're checking the time. Maybe there's an emergency. The thing about this is that there's a lot of different interpretations. Okay, so that's the thing is that we cannot conclude that there is one interpretation of any behavioral cue. But here's another thing. Once one cue gives us a positive or negative impression, that impression actually can start changing how we interpret everything else about the person. And that's going to take us to the halo and horn effects. And we're going to take a break right here, and then we'll come back with those and continue this lecture.